When I stepped into my son-in-law's $2 billion tower grand opening, my jacket was stained with hydraulic fluid grease and blood after saving a trapped woman in the parking garage. He looked me over, smirked, and said loudly, "Looks like a filthy old man wandered into the wrong party." My daughter hurried to my side and murmured, "Dad, please go clean yourself up." Then, not even minutes on, the whole tower lost power, and every last person there understood that the old pipe fitter they'd dismissed carried more knowledge of that structure's bones than anyone else in the building. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where the people who were counted out get to have the last word. If stories like this one speak to something you stay close and follow along, there's more where this came from. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, is this your first time here? Or have you been with us through a few of these stories already? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them. One quick note before we begin. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What's true is the heart of it, and that part, I believe, will stay with you. Names and places are fictional, but the truth inside it is not. The elevator doors opened on the 92nd floor, and I walked straight into the kind of silence that only falls over a room when 200 people catch sight of something they weren't prepared for. I was that something. My name is Harold Durbin. I am 64 years old. 40 years I spent crawling through the mechanical innards of structures that now shape the Chicago skyline, the pipes, the pressure systems, the hidden infrastructure that keeps water moving and heat alive on the coldest nights January can throw at you. I know every inch of this city's skeleton, but standing in the marble lobby of Apex Tower on the night of its grand opening, wearing a flannel jacket streaked with rust-brown pipe mud and dried hydraulic fluid, I felt like a man who had stumbled into the wrong century entirely. The room was blinding. White marble floors caught the light of 10,000 recessed LEDs and threw it back doubled. Women in floor-length gowns drifted through the space like slow planets. Men in custom suits gathered near the floor-to-ceiling windows, voices low and deliberate, the kind of talk where every syllable carries a price tag. The air carried aged bourbon, expensive perfume, and an ambition so dense you could choke on it. And then there was me. My left hand was still bleeding where I'd torn it open on a jagged piece of metal 40 minutes prior. I'd made an attempt to clean up in the parking garage elevator, but rust stains on flannel don't hide, and hydraulic fluid doesn't scrub off knuckles with a paper napkin. I looked exactly like what I was, a working man who had just handled something that needed handling, standing among people who had never once been called upon to handle it themselves. I spotted Celeste across the room, my daughter, 34 years old, dark hair pinned up, wearing a silver dress that caught the light with every small movement she made. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said, head tilted back posture, flawless. For half a second, she looked precisely like her mother on a good evening. Then she saw me. The laughter stopped. Her face went the color of the marble beneath her feet. "Harold," came a voice from my left, smooth and cold as river ice in February. Preston Ashford stepped forward from a cluster of dark-suited men, crystal glass of bourbon in one hand, a smile on his face that had never once in all my experience of him made it as far as his eyes. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that likely cost more than my truck. He studied me, the way a building inspector eyes a cracked foundation, clinical contempt, dressed up as concern. I have to say, Preston announced loud enough for the 6 men at his back to catch every word. I wasn't sure the dress code made it to the south side. He let the pause stretch, letting the laughter gather around him. "Tell me, gentlemen, does Apex Tower have a maintenance request we weren't notified about?" The laughter came easy and fast, the way it always does when the man holding the bourbon makes the joke. My jaw tightened. I could feel the dried mud cracking along the back of my hand. "Preston," I said, holding my voice steady. "I had a situation in the parking garage," I came to explain. "A situation," Preston repeated the word, the way you'd repeat something you'd found unpleasant on the bottom of your shoe. He took one measured step toward me, dropping his voice just enough to feel private while keeping it loud enough for everyone within 10 feet. "Harold, this is a $2 billion launch. There are city officials in this room. There are people here who could build 20 buildings like this one out of their checking accounts." He raised his hand and actually pointed at the rust stain on my left sleeve, his index finger stopping an inch short of the fabric, as though contact might contaminate him. "And you walked in here looking like you climbed out of a storm drain." My heart hammered, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back something bigger than anger, something closer to grief, the particular grief of a man who has done something genuinely right and is being told in front of witnesses that it makes him a problem. I helped someone, I said. In the parking garage, someone was in trouble. Of course you did, Preston said, and his smile was the worst variety of smile, the kind engineered to appear generous while stripping everything away. He turned back toward his companions. Gentlemen, this is Celeste's father. He was a pipefitter retired now. He said pipefitter the way you'd explain the term to a child who'd never heard it before. He means well. The men nodded with the polite glazed expressions of people who had already moved on in their heads. Celeste had crossed the room. She appeared at my elbow, her fingers closing around my forearm with a grip firm enough to bruise her manicured nails pressing through the flannel. Dad. Her voice was a hiss, low sharp. The sound of a woman fighting to hold a situation together as it slipped away from her. What happened to you? You look like she stopped herself, eyes cutting sideways toward Preston's group, then back to me. You look like you walked off a job site. I know how I look, I said. Celeste, there was a woman in the garage, her car locked up on her. She couldn't breathe. I had to get under the chassis to reach the manual release. It wasn't quick work, and it wasn't clean, but she's all right now. I came up here as fast as I could after. Celeste's expression moved through something complicated and painful. For just a moment, a half second, I saw the girl who used to pass me wrenches in the driveway on Saturday mornings, the one who understood exactly what it meant when her father came home with grease under his nails. I saw her recognize what I'd just described. Then Preston appeared at her shoulder, and whatever had briefly opened between us closed again. There's a service corridor behind the catering station, Preston said, addressing me in the tone of a man giving directions to a delivery driver. Celeste can show you where the restrooms are down that way. Get cleaned up before someone points a camera at you. My chest burned. Not the angry kind of burn, the other one. The kind that sits right behind the sternum and has no proper name except loss. Preston. I looked at him directly. I want you to look at the watch on your wrist. His eyes dropped to it involuntarily, then came back up. I know where that money came from, I said quietly, and I think there are people in this room tonight who would find that very interesting. The air between us shifted. Something pulled tight in Preston's jaw, and then every light in Apex Tower went out. To understand why my hands were bleeding when I walked into that party, you have to go back 40 minutes back down to level 4 of the parking garage beneath Apex Tower, where the fluorescent lights had been stuttering for the better part of an hour, and the only other vehicle near mine was a black Lincoln Navigator L that was clearly not behaving the way a $90,000 SUV is meant to behave. I had parked my truck on P4 because it was the lowest level, the farthest point from the lobby elevators, the spot least likely to embarrass Celeste with its cracked windshield and the Durban mechanical decal. I hadn't been able to bring myself to scrape off the rear window even 2 years after shutting the business down. I was in the driver's seat adjusting my tie in the rearview mirror, the deep burgundy silk tie Nadine had given me for our anniversary in 2014, the one I kept in its original box on the top shelf of the closet when I heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Slow rhythmic fading a hand against glass. I was out of the truck before any conscious decision had been made. That's 40 years of emergency calls for you. Your body learns to move before your mind has finished forming the thought. The Navigator was parked in the far corner of P4 beneath a light that was cycling between dim and dead. The rear doors were partially raised and frozen, stuck at a 45-degree angle like broken wings, neither open nor shut. Through the tinted glass, I could make out a figure inside a woman, silver-haired, disheveled, both palms pressed flat against the window. I got close enough to read her lips. Help me, please. I can't breathe. Ma'am, I hear you, I said, raising my voice, pressing my own palms to the glass. My name is Harold Durbin. I'm a mechanical contractor. I'm going to get you out. Can you tell me how long you've been in there? Her voice came through muffled trembling. 20 minutes, maybe more. The doors locked on their own. The controls are completely dead. I keep pressing everything and nothing responds. I had encountered this class of problem before, not with a Lincoln specifically, but the underlying failure pattern was familiar. High-end vehicles in the 2010s and 2020s had begun integrating their door systems with the onboard computer network. If that network crashed or was struck by an external signal, the physical locks could engage and refuse to release until the systems cycled back up. In a sealed cabin with failing ventilation, 20 minutes was already serious. 30 would be dangerous. Stay with me, I told her. Look at my face, not the walls. Slow breaths. There's air in there. It's just moving slower than you'd like. I worked fast. Checked the door seams. No mechanical gap I could exploit from outside. Checked the charging port on the rear panel. Dead. Press the external emergency release that Lincoln puts on the B pillar for exactly this kind of situation. Nothing. The button clicked, but the signal reached nothing. Then I caught the smell, faint but unmistakable to anyone who has spent 4 decades around electrical systems. Ozone. The sharp metallic bite of a circuit board hit with more current than it was built to carry. I dropped to the concrete. The garage floor was cold and damp, the kind of cold that soaks through clothing in under a minute. I didn't care. I got my shoulders beneath the rear chassis and swept the undercarriage with my phone, flashlight, hydraulic lines, brake assemblies, rear suspension components. And there, nestled tight against the interior face of the left rear wheel, well zip-tied to a bracket with a deliberateness that leaves no room for accident, was a device roughly the size of a deck of playing cards, black housing a small antenna, a single LED blinking red in a slow and steady pulse, a signal jammer. Under federal law specifically, FCC regulations, Title 47, it is a federal crime to operate, market, or import a signal jammer on American soil. They suppress radio frequencies across a range broad enough to include cellular signals and the wireless communication links that modern vehicles rely on between their door controllers and central computers. This one had been positioned precisely to maximize interference with the navigator's rear door system, while leaving the vehicle's primary functions intact. Whoever put it there understood exactly what they were doing. This was no malfunction. This was a trap. My stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the floor beneath me. There was no time to think through what that meant. The woman's breathing was audible through the glass, now shallow and fast, the early markers of a panic attack tightening towards something worse. I located the manual release cable, the physical override built into every hydraulic door system, precisely because engineers understand that electronics fail, and I pulled. The cable was jammed. The localized electrical surge from the jammer had produced a secondary lockup in the manual release mechanism, the kind of cascading failure that shouldn't have been possible, but becomes possible when someone has deliberately engineered the conditions for it. "Come on," I said through my teeth, shifting my grip. My left hand found a sharp edge on the chassis bracket, and I felt the skin open hot and immediate. I didn't stop. "Come on, you stubborn thing." I gave it everything I had. The manual release gave way with a sound like a gunshot in the concrete quiet of P4. A heavy metallic crack, then immediately the hiss of hydraulic pressure bleeding off. A burst of hot fluid caught my face and chest. The rear door groaned upward, and the rush of cold garage air hit me like a wall. The woman half fell, half climbed out of the vehicle. I caught her by the arm before she went down, steadying her against the rear quarter panel. She was pulling in long, desperate lungfuls of air, both hands locked around my forearm with a strength that caught me off guard. "Easy," I said. "You're out. Take your time." She lifted her face and looked directly at me, and I recognized her. Harriet Crane. 75 years old, founder and sole owner of Crane Properties, one of the largest privately held real estate portfolios on the East Coast. I had seen her photograph in trade journals going back 15 years. The woman who had quietly acquired and restored more landmark buildings in this city than most developers manage in a lifetime. She was the kind of person whose name showed up on plaques rather than lease agreements. She was also, I now grasped with a jolt of cold clarity, the actual owner of the building I was standing beneath. She stopped, drew a deliberate breath. "What is your name?" "Harold Durbin. Ma'am, I'm a mechanical contractor." "Oh, Harold." She reached into her coat with a trembling hand and pressed something into my palm. A business card, heavy stock, textured, a single image embossed in gold on the front. An iron bridge, no name, just a phone number. "Hold on to that." I looked at the card for 2 seconds. Then I checked my watch. 12 minutes before the grand opening reception began on the 92nd floor. I was soaked in hydraulic fluid. My left hand was bleeding onto the concrete, and my deep burgundy silk tie was beyond any hope of salvage. "I have to go," I said. "My daughter's event is upstairs. Are you all right? Should I call someone?" Harriet Crane pulled herself upright. The trembling was already draining from her hands, replaced by something composed and exact, the bearing of a woman who has spent 50 years making decisions under pressure and long since mastered it. "Go," she said. "I'll manage from here." I ran for the elevator. In the mirrored steel of the doors, as the car climbed toward 92, I caught my own reflection, and my heart went straight to the floor. I looked like I'd lost an argument with a boiler room. The rust and mud from earlier had been joined by hydraulic fluid spreading in a dark stain across my chest, my left sleeve, the front of the jacket. My hand was leaving a slow red streak on the elevator wall where I'd braced myself. I looked at the business card in my palm. Iron Bridge Gold embossed a private number with no name attached. Crane Properties. She owns this building, I thought. Preston thinks he built something tonight. The elevator chimed, floor 92. The doors opened and 200 people turned to look at me. Standing there with hydraulic fluid drying on my chest and Nadine's ruined tie hanging crooked at my collar, I made the mistake of looking at my reflection too long. And when you hold your own gaze in a mirror on the worst night you've had in recent memory, your mind does what it always does. It goes searching for the last time things felt right. For me, that was a hospital room, 4th floor Bridgeport Medical Center, November of 2019. Room 412 carried the smell. All hospital rooms acquire past a certain point. Antiseptic layered over something sweeter and more final, the scent of a body working far too hard to hold on. I had been sitting in the vinyl chair beside Nadine's bed for 11 hours straight, and I was beginning to lose the line between the hum of the fluorescent light overhead and the hum of the monitors charting her heart. Nadine Durbin had been the kind of woman who filled every room she entered not loudly. Not through performance, but with a quality of attention that made whoever she was with feel like the most important thing happening in the world was whatever they were about to say next. She had grown up in a small house in South Shore, daughter of a plumber and a school librarian, and she had carried both of those inheritances forward, a respect for work done with your hands and a fierce belief in the power of a story told well. She had loved me since I was 22 years old and still had all my hair, and in 32 years of marriage she had never once made me feel small for what I did for a living. That night she weighed about as much as the memory of herself. "Harold." Her voice was thin, threaded through with effort. Her hand found mine on top of the blanket fingers, folding around my knuckles with a grip that was more intention than strength. "Is Celeste coming?" "She's on her way, Nadine." My throat was tight. "She'll be here." Nadine smiled at that. A small, knowing curve of her lips that broke something open in my chest, because Nadine had always been able to tell when I was managing her. "I know about the savings account," she said. I went still. "The one at the Archer Avenue Credit Union." She continued, eyes half closed, but her voice finding a thread of sharpness. "The one you've been putting overtime money into since Celeste started high school. I found the statements 2 years ago. I didn't say anything because—" she paused to gather breath. "Because it was the most Harold Durbin thing I had ever seen in my life, and I didn't want to ruin it." My eyes burned. My lips pressed hard together. "Nadine, let me finish." Her grip on my hand tightened. "There's something I need from you, and it has nothing to do with the money. Money's just money." She turned her head against the pillow, looking straight at me, and I made myself hold her eyes, even though the sheer effort behind them was nearly more than I could bear. "Harold, don't let her lose sight of where she came from. Don't ever let this family be something she's embarrassed by. I need to hear you say she'll understand that people who build things with their hands, people like the two of us, are worth every bit as much as anyone in any room." "I promise," I said. My voice gave out on the second word. "And the ring?" Nadine raised her free hand toward the nightstand. The engagement ring, the one I'd saved up for all through the summer of 1987, bought with the very first full paycheck I drew from the pipe fitters union. A plain silver band, a small inset diamond, the kind the jeweler had been decent enough never to call modest, resting in a little dish next to her water glass. "When Celeste is ready, that belongs to her. She'll understand what it says. It says this family is real. It says your roots aren't a thing to be ashamed of." I lifted the ring from the dish, still warm from sitting near the lamp. My fist closed around it. "I'll make sure she gets it," I said. Nadine's gaze drifted toward the door. "She's late. She sent a text traffic." "She's nervous," Nadine said, with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 30 years knowing her daughter better than her daughter knew herself. She was always like that. Even as a child, if a friend got hurt at school, she'd just lock up. Didn't know where to put it. A breath. "Go easy on her, Harold. The love is there. She just goes quiet when things get hard." I nodded. There was nothing in me that could form a word. "You are the finest man I have ever known." Nadine said it the way she said everything plainly without a single wasted syllable. Every ounce of what she meant carried openly. Not because you never got anything wrong, because whenever something needed doing for 32 years, you were the one already doing it. Her fingers slackened around mine, then found their grip again. On purpose. Don't you let anyone take that from you. The door eased open. Celeste slipped in without a sound, still in her coat eyes jumping to the monitors first, before settling on Nadine. She was 29 that November, 3 years past graduation, holding down a marketing coordinator job in the Loop that she described with a kind of polished, rehearsed energy that always gave me the feeling she was performing a life rather than actually inhabiting one. She came to Nadine's side and took her other hand, and for a stretch of minutes the three of us were simply present together, the rhythm of the monitors marking the time. Nadine floated in and out. Once she said something soft about the garden she had always pictured behind our house in Bridgeport, a plan we'd discussed for 15 years without ever setting a single seed. Next spring, I told her. Next spring, she said back. The monitor flatlined a little past 2 in the morning. That sustained, unwavering tone was the most absolute sound I have ever sat with. Nothing theatrical about it, no crescendo, no drama. Just the cold mechanical fact that a circuit had opened permanently. I was still holding her hand. Celeste stood with her back against the wall, arms folded tight across herself, weeping in that silent, trembling way that belongs to people who were taught somewhere along the line that grief is private business, not for public display. I wanted to cross the room to her. I wanted to say that breaking open was the honest response, the one Nadine herself would have welcomed. But the wall was already going up. I could watch it being built in real time. The jaw that hardened, the quick swipe of her knuckles across her cheek, the spine that pulled itself straight, the eyes that went to her phone, hunting for something to land on. I looked down at the ring in my palm, Nadine's ring, silver unadorned and completely true. I tucked it into my shirt pocket right over the place where the hurt had taken up residence. 4.5 years on riding that elevator up to the grand opening, I pressed my right hand to my chest over that same pocket and felt only stiff, hydraulic-soaked fabric. 2 full years I had carried that ring, holding it for the moment Nadine had foreseen, the moment Celeste would be ready. Still hadn't come. The elevator opened on 92, and the party noise washed over me. Somewhere in that crowd, my daughter was already calculating what to do with the fact that her father had turned up looking like a man who earns his living with his hands. 6 months after we laid Nadine to rest, I pulled on the blazer I'd worn to her funeral, climbed into my truck, and made the drive into Chicago for the first time in years. Celeste had asked me to come. I'd have crossed the Dan Ryan barefoot just to see her face light up. The University of Chicago Booth School of Business graduation fell on a Thursday in May, the sort of morning that makes you forgive the city for the 5 brutal months it just put you through. The plaza was dense with families' bespoke suits, silk dresses, everyone oriented toward the stage with the very specific pride of people who had signed large checks and meant to see a return. I planted myself near the rear in that same funeral blazer, hands deep in my pockets, calluses, and all feeling precisely as conspicuous as I must have appeared. Didn't matter. Celeste was walking across that stage in 20 minutes, and 16 years of double shifts and union overtime had bought her that moment. When she finally broke through the crowd and reached me diploma in hand, her face held the kind of joy that's only possible when you've crossed a line you weren't fully certain you'd reach. She wrapped her arms around my neck, and I pulled her in close, taking in the unfamiliar perfume, the stiff ceremonial gown pressed against my worn lapel. "I did it, Dad," she said into my shoulder, and her voice broke on that last word exactly the way you'd want it to. "You did it," I told her. "Your mother always knew." She stepped back, eyes shining, face flushed. Then her gaze moved past my shoulder, and something in her expression quietly rearranged itself, the way a compass settles when it finds true north. "Dad, there's someone I want you to meet." Preston Ashford came forward from just behind her left shoulder. My immediate read a man constitutionally incapable of entering any room in second position. Tall, heavy through the shoulders, in a charcoal suit, cut with the sort of precision that has nothing to do with a department store rack. Late 30s, dark hair, a jaw built to broadcast certainty. A smile that knew exactly what it was advertising. He put out his hand. "Preston Ashford. Celeste has spoken about you quite a bit, Harold." The grip was measured and firm, not a handshake so much as a credential. I met it the same way I always do. Straight no theater, 40 years of the trade in my knuckles. I hope she kept it decent, I said. Absolutely, he said and smiled. Then smoothly, almost too smoothly for me to fully register, his hand went to his breast pocket. Out came a pale gray silk pocket square. He touched it briefly to the palm he'd just pressed into mine, then returned it to his pocket as if the whole thing were pure habit. Nothing to it. Celeste hadn't noticed. She'd already turned away to flag someone across the plaza. I noticed. Dinner was at a steakhouse in the Loop, the sort of establishment where the menu omits the numbers entirely and the sommelier has your name memorized before your coat is off your back. Preston ordered from memory, then laid out his firm's development plans in the Fulton Market District, deploying the words scalable, disruptive, and velocity of capital before the first 4 minutes had elapsed. I made an effort, a genuine one. I actually worked the mechanical systems on 3 of the Fulton Market District projects. I offered during a lull. The pressure regulation in those structures is remarkable. Dual redundant pipe systems held to tolerances you normally only see in industrial settings. Preston turned a carefully attentive expression on me, the look of a man at a museum giving a placard its allotted seconds before moving on. Truly fascinating, Harold. Systems like that, it's almost like the bones of the old city preserved right inside the new one. A slow turn of his bourbon glass. A living museum in a way. People in those buildings stay warm through January because of systems like that, I said. Absolutely. Preston agreed with a smile that closed the topic like a door. Celeste was already typing something into her phone, nodding along to Preston's next sentence before he'd finished saying it. I watched her do it, watched her quietly, adjust her posture, her word, choices, the very rhythm of her speech, the way you'd tune a radio dial to a cleaner signal. When a colleague of Preston's swung by the table, Celeste sat up straighter and produced a smile built for photographs rather than conversations. We grew up near the park, she said brightly when the man asked where she was from. Lots of green space, very quiet. The park, Bridgeport Park, 3 blocks from our house on the south side, where I had taken her to feed the ducks every Saturday morning until she turned 9. Where Nadine and I had laid a blanket on the grass every 4th of July and watched the fireworks over the lake. Quiet neighborhood, I repeated once the colleague had drifted on. Celeste looked at me sharply. Dad, we live 2 blocks from the elevated train. Celeste, you could set your watch by that thing. I just meant... She stopped, glanced at Preston, who was topping off his glass and graciously performing deafness. I just meant it was a nice area. Which it is, which it was. I looked across the white tablecloth at my daughter and felt something I had no proper name for. Not anger, not exactly. Something quieter and more stubborn than that. The feeling you get watching someone you love try to compress themselves into a shape that doesn't suit them and pretend the compression doesn't cost anything. You don't sound like yourself tonight, I said, keeping my voice low. Celeste set her fork down. Her jaw went tight. I sound exactly like myself. You sound like someone rehearsing. The table held a small silence. Preston filled it by refilling Celeste's wine glass, smooth, unhurried, as though the quiet were perfectly comfortable, and nothing of consequence had occurred. Walking to my truck afterward, Celeste pulled me aside near the valet stand, her heels striking the pavement in a quick, restless beat. Dad, I need to ask you something. She kept her voice down, eyes angled toward the restaurant door behind us. Next time we're with Preston's people, could you leave out the pipe work? The Union history. She touched the pearl necklace at her collar, one I hadn't seen before. It makes people uneasy. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. Her gaze had already moved back past me, toward the light in the restaurant door toward Preston. I stood on that loop sidewalk in my funeral blazer and watched my daughter walk back inside. Preston Ashford had a particular gift for leaving you feeling grateful while he emptied your pockets. It took me longer than it should have to arrive at that understanding. The first real lesson came on a Tuesday night in August of 2020, when Celeste appeared at my door in Bridgeport. With mascara tracked down her face and a number in her head, she could barely say aloud without her voice giving way. "It's Cornelia," she said, standing at my kitchen counter under the fluorescent light, both hands around the coffee mug I'd set in front of her. Preston's mother, she's already chosen a gown from Vera Wang, $18,000. Dad, I don't make that kind of money at an entry-level salary, and his family is watching every single decision I make. If I show up in something off a department store rack, they will hold it over me forever. Her voice broke on that last sentence. Real tears, the kind that come from genuine fear, not performance. I looked at my daughter sitting at the same kitchen table where she had spread her homework out for 12 years. I thought of Nadine. I thought of the promise, and I reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator where I kept the Archer Avenue Credit Union passbook. The next morning, I withdrew $75,000 from the retirement account I had been building since 1986. Every double shift, every 2 in the morning emergency call-out, every holiday weekend I'd spent on the clock instead of at home. All those years I had been setting money aside for when my knees finally decided they were done hauling weight up ladders. Now, I was spending it on a silk dress for a wedding I hadn't been consulted about. I put the money in a plain white envelope and handed it to Celeste in the kitchen that evening. No ceremony to it. It's for the dress, I said, and whatever else you need to feel like yourself walking down that aisle. She took it in both hands and her eyes filled again. Not with fear this time, but with something more layered, a tangle of relief and guilt. She folded quickly behind a grateful smile. Dad, you shouldn't have. This is too much. It isn't, I said, and don't mention it to Preston. I don't want him feeling obligated to a pipe fitter from the south side. She promised. She held on to me at the door, and I stood on the porch watching her taillights go around the corner, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had done something that actually mattered. 3 weeks later, she called to say she had lost the envelope. She had charged her card instead. Something in that sat wrong with me. But I was 63 years old, and I had spent my whole life taking the people I loved at their word, so I filed it away in the part of my mind I kept for things I'd rather not look at too squarely. Then came the brunch in Lake Forest. Cornelia and Reginald Ashford lived in a colonial estate there, with a driveway of crushed white limestone that ground under my truck tires like I was rolling over somebody's goodwill. The house had 11 rooms, and the particular hush of a place where no child had ever slid down the banister. Cornelia met me in the foyer, wearing a smile like a freshly pressed tablecloth, white smooth and entirely without warmth. She was 64, dressed with the kind of precision that leaves nothing to chance her posture, carrying the message she'd been taught to deliver since girlhood: how you hold your spine announces what you're worth. Harold, she said, clasping my hand between both of hers, Celeste has told us so much about your work, how wonderful that you've had such a physical career. I smiled. 40 years keeping the pipes running in Chicago's buildings. Mrs. Ashford, somebody has to. She led us out to the patio, where the sterling silver and crystal arranged themselves against the morning sun, with the kind of aggressive precision that signals a person who equates order with moral standing. Over eggs, Benedict Cornelia steered the conversation toward what she called the noble simplicity of tradeswork, her tone carrying the warm condescension of someone describing a charming folk custom they had encountered in a magazine. There is something almost prehistoric about genuine manual skill, she said, raising her mimosa. So refreshing in an age of everything digital men who still work with their hands. She smiled at me across the table. Almost like a living artifact, isn't it? My jaw locked. Celeste was studying her plate with great concentration. There is nothing prehistoric about a building's mechanical systems. Mrs. Ashford, I said, keeping my voice level. Without proper pipe pressure, the 12 bathrooms in this house don't work. Without the heating systems that someone like me put in and keeps running, your floors are cold in January. Cornelia tilted her head with the expression of someone examining a mildly interesting specimen. Of course, she said pleasantly, as though I had confirmed her thesis rather than contested it. Walking to my truck after brunch, Celeste caught up to my elbow. Dad! Her voice was low and tight and urgent. Please don't do that in front of them. Do what? Defend yourself like that. It draws attention. I stopped. Celeste, she called me a living artifact. She was being complimentary in her own way. Celeste looked past me toward the house. They have friends here, Dad. People who are important to Preston's business. Just let things go. For me. Please. I looked at my daughter standing on the Ashford's limestone in her new heels, and her practiced smile asking me to make myself smaller, so she could feel larger. 2 months after that, I ran into Preston at a charity function Celeste had brought me to in the Loop. He was wearing a new watch, a Patek Philippe Aquanaut, $15,000, the kind I had seen in the trade journals Celeste now kept on her coffee table. A quick search on my phone in the parking garage afterward confirmed the price. I sat in my truck for a long time running numbers I didn't want to run. The Palmer house on a June morning looks like something lifted out of a story meant for grandchildren, all pale stone and gold trim beneath a sky too blue to be accidental. I had walked past it 100 times on jobs in the Loop, carrying pipe fittings through the service entrances of buildings on Michigan Avenue, while the guests came and went through the front. I had never once pictured myself walking my daughter down the aisle inside it. Nobody warned me that 2 hours after walking my daughter down the aisle, I'd be tucked behind a marble pillar with a plate of poached salmon, keeping time with the dishwashers banging away in the service kitchen. Celeste was breathtaking. Let me put that down. Before I say anything else, the Vera Wang gown dark hair swept up, and Nadine's absence burning through every beautiful inch of her. The last time anything had hit me that hard was 32 years earlier, watching Nadine come toward me down a church aisle in Bridgeport. When Celeste slipped her arm through mine at the back of the processional and her fingers closed over my hand, there was an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with grief. "You look like your mother," I told her. Her eyes went glassy immediately. "Don't make me cry before I get down the aisle, Dad." "Too late," I said, and she laughed sudden, unguarded, the Celeste laugh I hadn't heard in months. Those 40 steps to the altar, the string quartet carrying us forward afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows in long golden sheets. For those few seconds we were only a father and his daughter, and none of the difficult things between us existed. Then the vows were done, and a young man in a stiff waistcoat materialized beside me. "Mr. Durbin, table 14, sir." "Right this way." Table 14 sat squarely behind a marble pillar. The thing had the girth of a mature oak, planted at what could only have been the deliberate confluence of the worst sightline in the ballroom and the heaviest foot traffic from the service corridor. From where I sat, I could make out maybe a third of the head table, a sliver of Celeste's left shoulder, and the swinging door that the catering staff treated like a revolving entry gate. The program was printed on heavy cream stock gold lettering throughout. I read every word of it twice over. My name was absent. Not buried in the wedding party list, not tucked into the acknowledgments, not folded into the single italicized line near the back. The bride's family extends its gratitude to all gathered here. Harold Durbin, the man who'd rewired his own home in Bridgeport, rather than pay an electrician, banking those savings toward his daughter's college fund. Who'd taken every holiday shift available, 3 Christmases, running at time and a half, to cover her University of Chicago, Booth School of Business tuition, who'd sealed his entire retirement into a plain white envelope and handed it over without conditions. That man did not appear anywhere in the official account of this day. Preston's father commandeered the podium and gave a speech about Celeste's graceful entry into the Ashford legacy, deploying the word refinement 4 times and the word family 7 times, never once glancing toward the father of the bride, who sat 30 feet away and had paid for the very dress they were busy celebrating. When the father-daughter dance was called, I made my way across the floor and took Celeste's hand. Her fingers were cool, and she kept a measured distance between us, her smile tracking the photographer rather than me. "Your mother would have loved this room," I said quietly as we moved. "Dad," her voice went flat precise, cutting right under the music. "Preston's investors are watching. We need to look the part. Please don't bring Mom into this right now." Something collapsed inside my chest. "Celeste," I said, keeping my voice level. "All I want is one genuine moment with my daughter on her wedding day. That's the whole ask." She leaned in, not toward me, but toward the air just beside my ear, her words dropping almost to nothing. "I need to tell you something. I need you to stay calm. The envelope, the $75,000. A pause. I didn't lose it. I handed it to Preston. I told him it came from his family so his parents would believe he was the one providing for me. I had to earn their respect, Dad. I needed them to see him as someone who could look after me." The quartet played on. Our feet kept moving. Crystal rang somewhere at the tables behind us. "You took my retirement," I said. The words came out softer than I meant them to, which made the whole thing land worse, not better. "And then, you handed it to the man whose family spent the last 20 minutes acting like you had no father at all." Celeste's grip tightened around my hand. "I'm sorry, I really am. But it worked, Dad. They took me in. Please don't cause a scene." I danced to the end of the song. I walked her back and delivered her to the head table. I shook Preston's hand because this was her wedding day, and I had made a promise to Nadine that I would hold myself together. Then I went out through the service corridor, past the dishwashers, past towers of empty champagne crates, and stepped into the warm June night. Near the service entrance in the parking lot, I found it. The memory chest I had spent 3 months building in my basement workshop. Walnut wood, dovetailed joints, hand-carved initials on the lid. A gift made with my hands because my hands were the only resource I had left. It had been shunted beside a recycling dumpster. A post-it note sat on top. Not in keeping with the aesthetic catering, please remove. I lowered the tailgate of my truck and sat there holding that box across my lap. The city was noisy, the night was warm, and somewhere on the other side of those walls, my daughter was slicing into a wedding cake, while the man beside her wore my retirement on his wrist. I made the drive back to Bridgeport with the memory chest riding in the truck bed, and when I got home, I took it down to the basement and draped a canvas tarp over it. Throwing it out was not something I could bring myself to do. I never quite sorted out why. 18 months of silence leaves its marks in ways nobody thinks to mention. You get to know which floorboards register the loudest at 2 in the morning when sleep won't come. You figure out that coffee brewed for 1 always sits half-finished, going cold on the counter around 8. You understand eventually that the stillness of a house from which someone has departed is a different creature entirely. From a house that was always empty, it has a density to it, a weight that settles across your shoulders every time you pass through a room that once held meaning. I turned 64 in September of 2023. The moment I knew no call was coming was precise. I'd had my eyes on my phone sitting there on the kitchen table from 7 that morning. By midday, the only thing my screen had offered was a pharmacy text nudging me to refill my blood pressure medication. I drove over to the bakery on Halstead Street and picked up a single cupcake lemon because Nadine always made lemon. I brought it home and sat at the kitchen table and ate it by myself and told myself it was all right. It was not all right. November arrived with Thanksgiving and the specific cruelty that holiday reserves for people who have no table to go to. I put a small turkey breast in the oven because the act of cooking was easier to bear than sitting in an unlit kitchen, facing the fact of my own absence from anywhere. Nadine's silver-framed photograph went at the far end of the table where it had stood every year since she died. I poured 2 glasses of the good wine. Then I made the error of opening my phone and pulling up Celeste's social media. The Ashford family Thanksgiving had been held at their Lake Forest estate, catered shot by a professional. Preston anchored the head of a table, set for 14, his arm around Celeste, the two of them luminous under the warm glow of what looked like a painstakingly arranged life. In the foreground of one image stood a small girl with dark curls, maybe 3 years old, whom I knew from a single out-of-focus photo Celeste had posted 8 months before, no caption, no tag. My granddaughter, Lily, growing up without ever learning my name. Happy Thanksgiving, Nadine, I said toward the photograph at the other end of the table. My voice came out rougher than I'd counted on. She's just busy this year. The lie sat in my mouth the way the cold coffee had been sitting in my stomach all day. A week on a Christmas card arrived, heavy cream stock, gold embossed lettering, inside a formal family portrait apparently taken in the Ashford foyer. I stood at the kitchen counter and turned it in the light for a long time, working through the signatures along the bottom. Preston Ashford, Lily Ashford, and then Celeste Ashford. Not Celeste Durbin Ashford. Not Celeste D. Ashford. Celeste Ashford. Clean and complete. The name I had given her. The name Nadine had carried for 32 years. The name on the deed to this house on my union card on the grave marker at Bridgeport Cemetery, erased pressed over in gold foil on expensive cardstock as though it had never been part of any of this. I set the card on the counter. My hands were calmer than they had any right to be, and that steadiness unsettled me far more than trembling would have. That same month was when I finally let myself reckon with what had become of the dollhouse. 60 nights in the basement had gone into building it. A craftsman-style dollhouse, hand-carved window frames, tiny copper circuits running to grain-of-wheat bulbs in every room. I'd done the wiring myself, a small brass toggle tucked under the front porch that brought the whole thing alive in warm gold light. I built it for Lily, for the granddaughter I had never once held, because working with your hands is the only language I have ever genuinely spoken. When I called Celeste to arrange getting it to her, her answer came back short and final. It's too Bridgeport, Dad. Doesn't fit the aesthetic. Just mail it. We'll find a place for it in storage. I boxed it up, shipped it, and waited for a video. A photograph, even a single line. What came back was an automated reply from Celeste's assistant. Package received, thanks. The following week I drove to their building and found it near the service entrance still in the shipping carton stamped for disposal, I loaded it into the truck bed, hauled it home, carried it down to the basement, and laid a canvas tarp across it. I couldn't put it in the trash. I still can't explain that. I went to the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out my phone log, kept on paper, an old reflex from job sites where digital records had a way of vanishing. A running record of every call placed to Celeste over the previous 3 months. 37 entries, dates, times, durations. 37 times I had dialed her number. 37 times the line had rolled to voicemail, or the call had been declined, or what came back was a text so stripped down it barely qualified as a reply. October 8th called to mention I'd spotted a photo of Lily on social media. Voicemail. November 3rd asked whether I could come by before the holidays. 11 days of nothing, then a text. We're really busy this season. Dad, Thanksgiving week called because that stretch of the year was the hardest to get through without Nadine. Got a text at 11 p.m. Sorry, Dad. Ashford brunch ran late. I folded the paper back and returned it to the drawer. Then in January, a courier turned up at the house. Not the regular mail carrier, a courier in a pressed uniform, arriving in a vehicle that cost more than my truck. He handed over an envelope with no return address, waited while I signed and left without a word. Inside was a VIP pass to the grand opening of Apex Tower, a development Preston had been posting about online for 2 years, and beneath it a note in Celeste's handwriting, deliberate practice, the penmanship of someone who had rehearsed what they meant to say. It's time to move past the misunderstandings, Dad. Preston genuinely wants you there to share in our success. It would mean a lot to both of us. I read it 4 times. The way you read a contract clause, you aren't sure you're parsing correctly. Looking for the language that flips the meaning. Then I turned the card over. On the back in smaller formal print, formal attire is non-negotiable. Guest list is finalized. Please confirm attendance by February 1st. Not an invitation. A summons with a dress code stapled to it. I looked over at Nadine's photograph. On the counter, the silver frame catching the flat January light. I looked at the stack of overdue utility bills beside it, and the bank statement I'd been leaving sealed for a week. One more night, Nadine, I said. One more time to let them know I haven't disappeared. I went to the closet and lifted out my one good suit, the charcoal polyester, single-breasted, bought off a rack at a department store in 2010 for Nadine's uncle's retirement dinner, the same suit I had worn to Nadine's funeral and to Celeste's wedding, and to every occasion in the years since that had called for, looking as though I belonged somewhere. I wasn't entirely sure I did. I hung it on the back of the bedroom door and stood there studying it. March 15th. Began the way most days that end up mattering, do quietly without any signal, carrying the particular stillness of an early morning that hasn't yet decided what it will become. I was up at 5:30. Sleep had barely come, 3 hours, maybe 4, broken into pieces, by the sort of half-dreams that are less about images than about sensations, a low current of dread moving beneath everything. I stood at the kitchen window with my first cup of coffee and watched the sky above Bridgeport shift from black to the specific gray-purple of a Midwest winter that isn't quite ready to release you. A few late-season snowflakes drifted past the glass, the tentative kind that fall without much conviction, as if testing whether anyone is paying attention. I had laid the suit across the bed the night before. Charcoal polyester, single-breasted, bought off a rack at a department store in 2010 for Nadine's uncle's retirement dinner. Dry cleaned twice since then, both times, by me. Once for Nadine's funeral, once for Celeste's wedding. It was not the suit of a man who attended events like the Apex Tower grand opening, but it was what I had, and I had pressed it the evening before, until the creases were sharp enough to mean something. On the top shelf of the closet, behind a box of Nadine's books I had never managed to donate, sat a navy blue case about the size of a shoebox. Inside was the deep burgundy silk tie Nadine had given me for our anniversary in 2014, still wrapped in the original tissue paper. I lifted it out the way you handle something that belongs to an earlier version of yourself. A small, folded square of paper slipped out from beneath the tissue. I picked it up. Nadine's handwriting, that distinctive forward, leaned the way she looped her lowercase letters. I am so proud of your working hands, Harold. Don't ever let anyone make you ashamed of them. All my love, always. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, holding that note for a long time. My eyes burned, and I let them burn. There was no one around to see it, and Nadine had always said that a man who refused to cry in his own bedroom wasn't protecting his dignity. He was only putting his grief on layaway. I folded the note and slid it into the breast pocket of the suit jacket, right side, close to where the hurt lived. Benny Caruso's barber shop on Halsted Street opened at 7. I was his first customer of the day. The place smelled exactly as it had for 30 years. Bay rum talcum powder. The faint sweet edge of the hot lather machine, warming up in the corner. Benny himself was 71 second-generation Sicilian-American cutting hair in Bridgeport, since before I'd moved to the neighborhood, with the particular gift of knowing when a man needed conversation and when he needed only the work. He settled the cape across my shoulders and studied my face in the mirror the way a craftsman sizes up a job. "Going somewhere important, Harold?" he asked, reaching for his comb. "My daughter's event," I said. "Big opening in the Loop." Benny gave a slow nod. "Haven't asked for the full treatment in a while. Haven't had a reason," I told him. He worked without hurrying. The clippers were warm against the back of my neck, the straight razor cold and precise along the jaw. I watched in the mirror as the man I'd been letting drift for 18 months came gradually back into focus. Cleaner lines, sharper edges, something returning to the eyes that looked less like exhaustion and more like resolve. "She know you're coming?" Benny asked. She sent the invitation herself. Benny made a sound somewhere between agreement and skepticism, the sound of a man who had known me long enough to hear what I wasn't saying. "You look good, Harold," he said at last, brushing down the cape. "You look like yourself." That landed harder than he knew. Back at the house, I dressed with care. The suit. Nadine's tie knotted twice before it sat right. My good shoes, black leather, resoled and polished that morning with the tin of wax from the workbench in the basement. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and took stock of the man looking back. 64 years old, gray at the temples and along the jaw. Hands that no amount of scrubbing would ever get entirely clean. The creases too deep, the evidence of 40 years of honest work pressed too thoroughly into the skin to ever come fully out. But standing straight, chin up. Nadine's note in the breast pocket and her ring still in its small velvet pouch, riding in the right front pocket of my trousers, waiting for the right moment. I checked the gas gauge on the truck in the driveway. The needle sat just above the quarter mark. I did the math, the loop, the parking garage, the drive home. The tank read just enough, precisely enough with nothing to spare, and somehow that felt right in a way I wasn't going to pick apart. I killed the kitchen, light-turned the deadbolt, and walked out to the truck through a dusting of snow that settled on my jacket shoulders and disappeared before it could accumulate. Out of the driveway on 31st Street, nose pointed toward the loop tunnel, Nadine's tie lying flat against my sternum, and her folded note riding over my heart. What was sitting in wait for me on level 4 of the Apex Tower parking structure, I had not the first idea. 64 years on this earth, and my daughter had asked me to come. That was the whole of my reasoning. I want to lay out exactly what took place in that garage, because before the night was over, someone would be circulating a version of it that bore very little resemblance to the truth. And the truth is the only thing worth holding on to, especially when the people who need it most are surrounded by mirrors and choosing which face to trust. I rolled into P4 at 7:43. That fourth level was the kind of structure built right, because people like me spent careers demanding it reinforced concrete decking, engineered drainage, load-rated clearances overhead. The lighting, though, was in bad shape. 2 fluorescent banks along the north wall strobing in and out on a 30-second cycle, the kind of flicker that warps a space into something you'd see in a nightmare. The Navigator caught my eye the instant I cleared the ramp. A black Lincoln Navigator, $90,000 of vehicle tucked into the far corner, directly beneath the worst of the failing fixtures. Its falcon wing rear doors had lifted partway and stalled. They're stuck at some midpoint between open and closed, like a creature that had tried to take flight and been frozen mid-motion. Something moved behind the tinted glass, 2 palms pressing flat against the window from the inside. I was out of the truck without a thought for the suit. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" My own hands went to the glass. The woman on the other side had silver hair, pulled back eyes, a clear, sharp blue, and the look of someone who has trained herself to stay composed her entire life, and is now watching that composure crack at the edges. Shallow breath was fogging the glass in rapid, uneven pulses. "The doors sealed on their own," she said, voice coming through muffled but controlled. 20 minutes. I've tried everything on the panel. Nothing moves. The air is getting... She stopped herself, drew her jaw tight, steadied. "The air is getting thin." "My name is Harold Durbin," I told her. Mechanical contractor. Hydraulic door systems, 30 years of them. Keep your eyes on mine, not the walls. You still have air in there. Fear is what's eating through it. Drop your breathing rate and you stretch what's left. She held my gaze with the focused raw trust of someone who has run out of any other choice. All right, she said. All right. I moved without wasting motion. External emergency release at the B pillar. It clicked and gave nothing back. Rear charging port dead. I went low, running my hands across the door seam, looking for a mechanical gap. There wasn't one. The onboard computer had locked every system at once, which put the source of failure somewhere above the individual door controllers upstream in whatever was feeding instructions to all of them. Then the smell reached me. Ozone. That sharp, acrid bite you don't mistake for anything else. The signature of a circuit board that has been pushed well past its rated capacity. I got down on the concrete and worked my shoulders under the rear chassis. The floor was wet, cold, and gritty. My jacket sleeve dragged through it. I let it drag. What occupied my mind was the woman in the sealed cabin above me, the shallow rhythm of her breathing, the way her hands had trembled against the glass. I ran my phone flashlight methodically along the undercarriage hydraulic lines, brake assemblies, suspension cradle, and there it was. Zip-tied to a bracket on the inward face of the left rear wheel, well, with the kind of precise, deliberate positioning that only comes from someone who studied this vehicle beforehand, a black unit about the size of a deck of cards. One antenna, one LED blinking red on a slow, even pulse. A signal jammer. Federal law is unambiguous on this point. Operating a signal jammer anywhere on U.S. soil is a crime under FCC regulations. No permits exist, no exceptions apply. No scenario makes it legal. This one had been mounted to cause maximum disruption to the wireless protocols linking the navigator's door controllers to its central computer. Nothing about the placement was improvised. The zip ties were too neat, the bracket too deliberate. Someone had researched this vehicle's architecture, prepared this device in advance, put Harriet Crane in that car, closed the doors, and walked calmly away. My gut went cold. I had no margin to work through what that meant. Her breathing had grown audible through the glass, rapid, shallow, the early physical warning signs of a panic attack, moving towards something harder to reverse. I located the manual release cable, the mechanical failsafe that engineers build into every hydraulic system because they know electronics cannot be trusted absolutely. I pulled. The cable had seized. The jammer's surge had bled into the manual release mechanism, producing a secondary lockup, one that would have required deliberate knowledge of the failure conditions to engineer. I reset my grip, planted my boots against the concrete, and drove every pound my 64-year-old frame still owned through my arms and into that cable. My left hand dragged across a bracket edge. The skin parted. I did not stop. Almost there, I called out loud enough to carry through the glass. I've got it. Hold on. The cable gave with a sound like a gunshot in that concrete chamber, one sharp crack bouncing off every wall, and then immediately the hiss and rush of hydraulic fluid finding the open line. A spray of it, hot dark, caught my face, my collar, the full front of my jacket and tie. The Falcon door shuddered upward. Cold air poured in from the garage. Harriet Crane came out of that vehicle in a near fall. I got hold of her forearm and held her steady against the rear quarter panel, while she pulled air in long, desperate drafts. Both hands clamped around my wrist, her composure stripped completely away. For exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds of unguarded bodily relief, and then she gathered herself back piece by piece with a deliberateness that was something to witness. "You saved my life," she said. "You needed air," I said. Anyone would have done the same. She looked straight at me. "No," she said. "They wouldn't. 23 minutes I was in that garage. 12 people went past this vehicle, not one broke stride." She reached inside her coat and pressed a card into my palm. Heavy stock gold embossed an Iron Bridge emblem. No name printed, only a phone number. "Keep that," she said. "I mean it." I turned it over. Iron Bridge. Below it, in small, precise type, Voss Properties Private Line. Voss Properties. I knew it the way anyone who had spent 40 years in Chicago construction knew it. Harriet Crane had spent decades assembling and developing landmark properties in this city, doing it quietly, never requiring the world to take notice. She owned more of this skyline than the skyline knew. She owned Apex Tower. Preston Ashford had not built this building. He had leased it, wrapped his name around it, and gathered 200 guests to toast it as his own creation. And tonight, he had made a calculated effort to ensure the woman who held the actual deed never reached the 92nd floor. "I have to go," I said, the weight of it landing on me all at once. "My daughter's event is upstairs. I'm already late." "Go," Harriet said, steadier with each breath. "I'll be up shortly." I ran for the elevator, bank boots pressing rust-colored marks into the concrete behind me. The mirrored doors showed me what I looked like. Hydraulic fluid dark across my chest and face. My left hand smearing a slow red streak on the elevator wall where I braced myself. Nadine's tie was destroyed. The suit, 15 years, 2 funerals, 1 wedding, was done. The card sat in my breast pocket. The elevator moved toward 92. It never occurred to me that Harriet Crane would come up right behind me, that the woman I had just freed from a sealed vehicle in the dark of a parking structure was about to step into that room and take everything apart. All I understood, walking out of those elevator doors into the white blaze of the Apex Tower lobby, was that I had handled what was in front of me. Whatever came next was already moving. 200 people in that room. And the sound I picked out above all of it was the small, familiar click of Preston Ashford's camera app. His phone was up before I had taken 3 steps off the elevator, thumb on the screen, framing the shot with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had been positioning himself for this moment all night. What comes next in this story is the moment everything Harold thought he understood about that evening gets turned over completely. The stakes become very personal, and the person who has been most confident all night is about to find out what that confidence was actually built on. Let me ask you this. If someone had been quietly working against you while wearing a friendly face, would you let the truth come out on its own, or would you find a way to bring it into the light yourself? The recessed LEDs caught that hydraulic stain across my chest and threw it back at the room, rust brown against white marble, impossible to overlook. "Hey, hold still, Harold." Preston's voice carried across the nearest cluster of guests, smooth, and projected the voice of a man who figured out early that a room defers to whoever sounds most certain of himself. This is going to make excellent content. Laughter rippled through the group closest to him, the easy, complicit kind that follows whoever's holding the bourbon. I didn't move. I held Preston's eye and refused him the flinch he was staging for his audience. Celeste appeared from my left, moving at speed heels, hitting the marble in quick, hard strikes. She got between Preston and me and pushed his phone hand down with a grip that carried more force than it looked like. "Preston, don't." Low voice, tight jaw. A woman managing a situation that had gone sideways on her and wanted no photographic record of it. She turned to face me, and what crossed her features in that moment, the blood draining out the jaw, going rigid, the eyes running a rapid calculation that had nothing to do with whether I was hurt, told me exactly why she had crossed the room. "Dad," she hissed, fingers closing on my forearm. "What happened to you? You look like you walked off a construction site." "There was a woman in the garage," I said. "Her vehicle sealed up on her. She couldn't get air. I freed her." Celeste's eyes cut sideways toward Preston's group, then back. "I don't care about the garage right now. Go to the service area, clean yourself up, come back." Celeste, I kept my voice even. "A woman nearly suffocated 40 floors beneath where we're standing. And I'm sure that's very heroic." The words landed clipped and cold and wrong, the way words do when someone knows what they're saying isn't right and says it anyway. "But there are 40 investors in this room, and the deputy mayor is 12 feet behind you, and you are covered in whatever that is, and I need you to please, please go through the service door." Preston materialized at her shoulder, with the timing of a man who had been waiting for his cue. "Gentlemen." He turned to the cluster behind him, 4 of them dark suits, the careful stillness of people with serious money and a serious interest in how the evening was tracking. Beside them stood Gerard Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Capital, 58 years old, silver-haired, his expression measuring things, with the patience of someone who had not built what he built by arriving at conclusions too quickly. "This is Celeste's father. He was a pipe fitter." Preston said the phrase with the deliberate enunciation of someone translating a foreign word for a polite audience. "He means well." The men offered glazed, courteous nods. "Harold." Preston stepped in, dropping his register to the pitch that mimics confidence but is actually a performance for the 4 people within earshot. "I understand something happened down there, genuinely unfortunate, but you need to grasp what this evening represents not just for me, Not just for Celeste, but for $40 million of committed capital currently in this room deciding whether to stay committed. He gestured at my chest. The stain. The ruined tie. Nadine's tie. You are a liability right now, he said. I mean that in the most literal financial sense. My jaw set until I could feel it in my back teeth. Cornelia Ashford materialized from Preston's right diamonds at her throat, catching the light. Her expression arranged into the specific shape of performed concern over genuine contempt. "Harold, dear," she said, opening her small clutch. "Can I get you something? Something to eat, perhaps? I'd like to ask about the watch on your wrist, Preston." The words came out of me level and quiet, cutting straight across whatever Cornelia had been about to say. Preston's eyes dropped to his left wrist without his meaning them to. The Patek Philippe Aquanaut, $15,000 of brushed steel and Swiss engineering. I know exactly what that piece cost, I said. And I know exactly where the $75,000 came from that made it possible. And I think Gerard over there, I looked directly at Whitmore, who had gone very still, would find it worth knowing that the financial underpinning of this project includes money lifted from a 63-year-old man's retirement account under false pretenses and applied to a private club membership and a watch. The atmosphere in that corner of the room shifted. Whitmore's gaze moved to Preston with a sharpness that was not social. Preston's face did something complicated and ugly, the polished confidence stuttering, and beneath it something raw surfacing the look of a man who has just discovered that a variable he believed he had controlled has broken free. "Dad, stop!" Celeste's voice cracked. She stepped between us, hand on my arm, eyes wide and cornered. "It was a gift. He gave it freely. You said so yourself. I told you it was for a wedding dress," I said, "not a club membership. Dad, tell them Celeste." My voice came out rougher than I wanted, worn down to its actual base. "Tell them where that money originated. Tell them what you said to me in this building's parking garage an hour ago." Celeste's face went the color of the marble beneath her feet. Her mouth opened, and every light in Apex Tower went out. No warning flicker. No gradual fade. One instant, the room blazed under 4,000 Kelvin of LED light. The next, absolute dark. Total immediate, the kind that a room of glass and steel produces when the power cuts, because there is nothing soft in it to hold the last traces of light. Someone screamed. Crystal shattered somewhere to my left. The crowd's murmur compressed at once into something louder and far less composed, the distinct sound of powerful people discovering that their power has a circuit breaker. I stood where I was and listened. The ceiling fans wound down with a slow descending whine. The HVAC clicked off. Underneath the noise of 200 unsettled people, I could hear the building's backup generators cycling, trying, failing, trying, again. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Whatever had gone wrong was well below any software fix. Darkness in a room built for powerful people does not register the same as darkness anywhere else. In my basement workshop, dark is neutral, the simple absence of light waiting for me to hit a switch. In the substations and server rooms where I spent 4 decades working, darkness meant something had failed and I needed to locate it. But darkness among people who have staked their identities on the belief that they control things, that is something else entirely. That feels like a verdict. The emergency LED strips at floor level blinked on after 90 seconds, throwing the room into a low red wash that made every face look like a different version of itself. I could see them now, pale, wide-eyed, turning toward each other and toward the windows, where the Chicago skyline continued its indifferent blaze 92 floors below, entirely unmoved by what was unfolding up here. "You did this?" Preston's voice came out of the red dark from somewhere to my right, loud, uncontrolled, the smooth performance of the evening stripped clean away. "You pulled something on the way up, some wire, some relay. I don't know how you managed it, but you did this deliberately. You did this to make me look bad." "Preston?" Celeste's voice urgent and low. "Stop talking. He's been a problem since the second he walked in here covered in Preston." Her voice jumped a register. "Your lapel mic is still on." A silence brief and terrible. In a venue like Apex Tower's 92nd floor, the audio system runs on a dedicated battery backup, a separate supply designed to keep communication functioning through precisely this kind of outage. Preston's wireless lapel microphone, which he had been wearing since his opening remarks, was still live on the building's emergency channel. Every word he had spoken in the last 60 seconds had been broadcast through the backup speakers mounted in the ceiling of every floor, from the lobby to the mechanical room. The realization reached Preston a moment too late. "I cut the final stress test," he said, and the voice coming out of him was unrecognizable from the one that had commanded the room all evening. The bravado had collapsed. Something frightened and exposed was underneath. The mic was still hot, still broadcasting everything. The load tolerance testing on the backup relay system. 6 weeks ago, I pulled it from the schedule to protect the budget. Nobody was going to... He cut himself off. Began again, quieter. The margins were tight, but I ran the numbers. I believed it would hold for one night. "Preston, please." Celeste's voice had gone threadbare, barely registering. "The whole room can hear you." "She had no business being here tonight," Preston said, and the words left him the way pressure leaves a cracked pipe, sudden and unstoppable. The old woman. The garage was supposed to handle it. She'd have been in a hospital somewhere getting looked at, and I'd have had the full evening to lock down the Whitmore relationship before she could interfere. Celeste broke. Preston stopped talking. From the far side of the room, I heard Gerard Whitmore issue something brief and forceful to the man at his elbow. The words didn't reach me across the crowd noise, but I didn't need them to. I have heard that particular register before the controlled fury of someone who has staked serious trust on a person and just caught them in a fundamental lie. I wasn't tracking Preston's unraveling with any gratification. My attention was elsewhere beneath the human layer of frightened voices, and Preston's confession and the sound of someone near the windows trying to raise a signal. Apex Tower itself was communicating. I spent 4 decades developing the ability to read a structure the way a conductor reads a score, to hear what it is telling you before it tells you loudly. The sub-basement generators had tried to restart 3 times and failed each time. The failure pattern had a rhythm to it: attempt, stall, reset, attempt, stall, reset. And the interval between each cycle, I knew that interval. It matched the jammer in the parking garage precisely. Not 2 problems. One problem intentionally constructed with 2 distinct pieces, the device in Harriet's vehicle, and a second component embedded somewhere in the building's own infrastructure, set to activate on a timer and manufacture exactly this kind of collapse. Preston hadn't merely skipped a safety test. He had left himself a back door. What we have here is not a power failure. My voice carried into the red dark level enough that the nearest group of guests turned toward it. It's a firmware loop. A script was loaded into the building's logic controller, built to present as a cascade failure, while running a deliberate managed shutdown in the background. The backup relays are not broken. They are being prevented from closing by a program that is executing right now inside the primary logic system. Gerard Whitmore's voice reached me from the left, measured tight. "How can you possibly know that? Because 40 minutes ago I was on the floor of your parking garage," I said, and I found the other component. Zip-tied to the wheel, well of a Lincoln Navigator L. A different silence followed that one, heavier. Preston made a noise. Not language, just an exhalation, involuntary, the sound a man makes when he watches the walls of something he built in secret become transparent all at once. "The redundant servers are offline," Whitmore said, his voice wound close. "My people are looking at diagnostic tablets that show all systems reading normal, which should be physically impossible given that this building is dark." I continued for him. "That's the architecture of the script. The monitoring dashboard receives clean false data while the actual relays remain locked open. The readout says stable. The building does not." I went quiet for a moment and listened to the stalled restart cycle pulsing beneath the floor. Your nose will confirm it if you're paying attention to that. The ozone had been accumulating for 2 minutes, that sharp, acrid smell that means circuit boards are absorbing load they were never rated for. And beneath it now, something more alarming, the faint scorched plastic odor of silicon components beginning to degrade at the edges of their tolerance. "I need to get into the server room," I said. "Not through the monitoring interface directly, the physical relay panels." Whitmore studied me in the red emergency light for a long 3 seconds. Then his gaze moved to Preston, who was utterly still, offering nothing, the last card already played. "Get this man downstairs to the server room," Whitmore said. "Something I have come to understand across 4 decades inside buildings is that the people who pass through them rarely grasp what those buildings already know. True ownership doesn't require a speech. The structure recognizes it. The atmosphere in a room shifts when the person who genuinely belongs there enters not from theatrics or announcement, but from something older and more reliable, like a circuit finding equilibrium the instant the ground wire connects. The emergency elevator at the corridor's far end stirred on its backup hydraulics, a low, resonant groan that moved through the crowd noise the way a bass note moves through static, present before people understand they're hearing it. The murmuring broke off. 200 people in varying degrees of alarm turned toward the sound in the red-washed dark, and the whole room's gravity seemed to shift. The elevator doors parted. Harriet Crane walked out. Nothing about her had been altered since I last saw her 20 minutes ago on the floor of P4 hydraulic fluid across her coat, the unmistakable physical signs of someone who had been genuinely afraid for their life. Every trace of that fear was gone. What she carried in its place was something I can only call settled command, the quality that accumulates in a person after 50 years of consequential decisions, the ones other people had to live inside. She had reached the point where that authority no longer needed to be projected, because it was simply present the way heat is present around a grounded transformer. 75 years old, silver hair, charcoal wool. She crossed the marble of the 92nd level with the unhurried step of someone who knew the ground beneath her feet was hers because it was. Preston made his attempt at recovery first. "Mrs. Crane." He moved forward, reaching for the smooth, professional voice with visible strain, the way someone tries to coax ignition from a flooded engine. "The forecast had suggested your arrival might be—" "The weather was not the obstacle, Preston." Harriet's voice was quiet. It reached every wall anyway. "Neither was the device your people attached to my wheel well." She said it without turning to look at him. Her eyes were moving across the room with the methodical sweep of something calibrated, and when they landed on me, standing near Whitmore stained with rust and hydraulic fluid, my left hand still bearing its dried red streak, she crossed to me in a straight line, without hesitation. The crowd gave way as she moved through it, not in a rush, not dramatically but steadily. The way water finds its path, people yielding, without knowing quite what had prompted them to. She stopped in front of me and drew something from her coat pocket. "Is this yours?" The heavy stock iron bridge card, the one she'd placed in my palm in the garage. I recognized it at once. I had pocketed it before I ran for the elevator. It must have worked loose somewhere on the 92nd floor when I came in. "Yes, ma'am," I said. Harriet turned to address the room. No raised voice, no need for one. "I'm going to tell you what actually took place this evening," she said, "because I was present for the portion that happened 40 feet below this floor, and I can promise you that what the man who organized tonight's event is preparing to tell you will bear a limited resemblance to what occurred." She laid it out: the garage, the sealed vehicle, 23 minutes of air, running thin, 12 people who had passed without breaking stride, and then the one who hadn't, who had gone down onto the concrete in his good suit, torn his hand open on a bracket, and dragged a seized cable loose with nothing but grip and weight, while hydraulic fluid drenched everything he was wearing. Not one person in that room made a sound. "There is one more thing I need you to know," Harriet went on, and the edge that entered her voice caused visible discomfort in several of the board members. "While the elevator was carrying me up to this floor, I could hear the building's emergency audio channel through the cab's speaker panel. Every word exchanged in this room during the last 12 minutes went out over that channel." She turned and for the first time looked directly at Preston. "Every word." Preston's face, already drained of color, in the emergency light went somewhere past gray, a shade that didn't have a name in ordinary use. "You referred to this man as manual trash," Harriet said. "You stood in front of your investors and called him a liability. You characterized his being here as an embarrassment." The pause that followed carried the measured, deliberate weight of a structural load being transferred. "This man is the sole reason I am on my feet in your building, rather than being removed from your parking garage on a stretcher." Jared Whitmore made a small sound in his throat. "Harriet Jared said, on behalf of Whitmore Capital." She gave him a look that offered nothing. "Right now, your finest engineers are huddled inside that server room, jabbing at keyboards and trusting readouts that are actively deceiving them. I am not looking for a manager. I am looking for a master. Those two things are entirely different." She brought her eyes back to me. "Mr. Durbin." "Ma'am, down in the garage, you told me you understood what had gone wrong with my car's systems. And you just told Gerard you understand what has gone wrong with this building's." Her gaze didn't waver. "Are you prepared to go in there and correct it?" I hadn't yet drawn breath to answer when Celeste pushed forward out of the crowd's edge. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Mrs. Crane, he is my father. Whatever Preston said here tonight, whatever I stood by and let unfold, none of it was right. He walked through that door to be in my corner, and I—" Her voice collapsed on the last word. Both hands flew to her mouth, her whole frame trembling. Harriet studied Celeste in silence for a long beat. Her reply, when it came, held neither cruelty nor softness, something in the narrow space between. "I am aware of who he is to you, Celeste. What I'm less certain of is whether you are." Celeste produced a sound that had no word in it. Raw and wet and fractured, it rose from somewhere the voice alone can't reach. Harriet faced me again. Every person in that room seemed to stop breathing at once. "What I require isn't a visionary Mr. Durbin," she said. "Not a disruptor, not a collaborator, not a brand ambassador. What I need is someone who understands how this structure actually functions at its core, beneath the software layers, beneath the dashboards, beneath whatever language the marketing people invented for it." One brief glance toward Preston, who stood fixed in place and intended to stay that way. "Would you do me the courtesy of demonstrating to these people what genuine mastery looks like in practice?" My eyes dropped to my own hands. Rust worked into every crease. A gash across the left palm sealed over by now. The hands of a man with 4 decades of holding buildings like this one together. "Take me to the server room," I said. The server room on the 88th floor of Apex Tower had been designed to function as the operation's central intelligence, a climate-controlled monument to redundancy and fail-safe engineering, the sort of infrastructure that demands $8 million to construct, and is categorically not supposed to be the point of failure. Walking through that door, I found something closer to the wreckage left by a full-scale panic. Red diagnostic lights strobing across every rack in the room. The odor of burned silicon, hanging thick inside the recycled air, acrid enough to catch at the back of the throat. 6 young engineers in fitted vests moving with the brisk, useless confidence of men whose training had not prepared them for systems that were lying to their faces. One of them couldn't have been past his mid-20s dark vest. The kind of haircut that costs real money was bent over a workstation, cycling through the same reboot sequence for what looked like the 4th attempt at minimum. His screen declared every system green, fully nominal. The building beyond that door was sitting in the dark. "Son, get away from that keyboard," I said. He wheeled around startled. His gaze tracked from my rust-marked jacket up to Harriet Crane, stationed behind me, then landed back on me. The math of it, working visibly across his expression. "Sir, the dashboard is indicating all primary systems are. The dashboard is wrong." I kept my voice level, but I left no opening for debate. "What you have here is a hardware fault, and you're attempting to address it through software. It makes no difference how many cycles you run on that monitoring interface. Those relays are physically seized. The dashboard has no awareness of that, because the identical script that sees them is simultaneously sending fabricated status data to every display in this room." He held my look, not quite believing it. That can't be architecturally possible. Certainly it is if someone built a backdoor into the original logic controller installation. I told him, which happens also to be, for the record, a federal offense under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a statute specifically designed to cover the intentional corruption of protected computer systems. But the lawyers can untangle that part. What I need from you right now is the physical relay panels, not the software interface, the hardware itself, in the wall. He brought me across the server room to the far wall, where a floor-to-ceiling array of high-voltage contactors and relay switches stretched the full width of the space, the actual skeletal framework of the building's power distribution. The steel and copper reality that existed long before anyone coined the phrase smart building. Apex Tower's press releases had nothing to say about this section. No touchscreen panels, no voice commands, just heavy industrial enclosures. Copper bus bars and the class of components that go in once and outlast the men who installed them, provided you show them the proper respect. I unlatched my toolbox. It had stayed in the truck during the party. A man like me doesn't walk a copper jumper wire into a black tie affair even on a night that would have justified it. But the moment Harriet told Whitmore she was after a master rather than a technician, Whitmore had dispatched one of his people down to my truck in P4 to bring it up. That old Craftsman steel box had traveled with me since 1988, one corner dented from a drop, inside a Southside substation, the latches polished featureless by 35 years of daily handling. Beside the gleaming equipment that surrounded it, the thing looked as foreign as I had felt upstairs. Harriet said nothing when she laid eyes on it. She simply stood and waited. I pressed both palms flat against the relay panel and closed my eyes. 10 seconds. Reading the system, the way a doctor reads a pulse through touch, through what the vibration tells you before your eyes engage. Something was off. A micro-oscillation in the third bank from the left, faint but unmistakable, a tremor with no legitimate cause. The physical trace of a contactor pinned inside a state it was built to pass through, not inhabit. I opened my eyes and put my finger on it. Third bank. The backup relay controller has fallen into a loop. It's being fed a constant close command by the logic script, and that signal is blocking the open and reset sequence it requires to bring the secondary power bus back online. "What's the path to killing the script?" the young engineer asked, crowding in closer. "No, we don't kill it," I said. "Not from this room, not tonight, not within any window that matters to us. That script lives below the operating system. It's seated in the firmware layer, out of reach of any keyboard in this building. Shutting it down the right way means reflashing the controller firmware, and that's a 4 to 6 hour operation with proper equipment." My work gloves were already going on the leather at the fingertips worn nearly through from the accumulated weight of jobs exactly like this one. But killing the script isn't necessary. What we need is to strip it of any relevance. From the toolbox, I drew a copper jumper wire, 8 inches 16 gauge and alligator clip, crimped to each end. Something so elementary a high school electronics bench would own 3 of them. Against $8 million worth of server infrastructure, the thing was almost absurd. Almost. The move, I said, half to myself, half toward the engineer, is to cut the compromised relay controller out of the picture entirely and run a direct physical path between the secondary power bus and the primary feed. The script can issue its close command from now until morning. It'll be sending instructions to a controller that no longer sits in the loop. I found my 2 bus bars primary feed terminal, left side of the third bank. Secondary bus input, right side, and before a finger went anywhere near either one, I put my meter on them. 480 volts, 3-phase. Sufficient to end a man's life without ceremony if he let his attention slip. My attention had not slipped once in 40 years at these voltages. It was not going to slip now. "Clear the area," I said. 2 meters back, everyone. This is a live bypass across a 480-volt industrial circuit. I thread this correctly, the building wakes up. I thread it wrong, and there will be nothing subtle about what follows. The engineers fell back. Harriet, positioned near the doorway, retreated a few feet, not quite the clearance I'd have chosen for her, but I had already formed a clear picture of the fact that Harriet Crane did not take direction from someone she'd known for less than an hour. I set the first clip in place. The moment that copper contact met the primary feed terminal, the current announced itself through my skeleton. Not as pain, not yet, but as that ancient bone-deep alertness you develop after years of working beside forces that forgive nothing. The same alertness that had carried me through 4 decades of labor, that had put less careful men in the ground with some regularity. I shifted to the second terminal. "Come on," I said just above a whisper. Not addressed to anyone standing in that room. Addressed to the building itself. To 40 years of early mornings and late nights, every conduit I'd chased and every system I'd coaxed back from the edge of a complete shutdown. One more job, old friend. The second clip bit home. What the building did next, it did loudly. The high-voltage contactors in the third bank fired in sequence a series of heavy mechanical strikes. Clack, clack, clack. Several hundred pounds of spring-loaded steel snapping home one after the next. The kind of sound that registers in your chest cavity before it reaches your ears. The fluorescent strips inside the server room, lit first, then the corridor beyond. Then it moved upward floor by floor, a rising wave, until all 92 stories of Apex Tower's LED system flooded back to life, the whole glass and steel column blazing against the Chicago night. Somewhere behind me, one of the engineers exhaled a breath that had been locked inside for the better part of 10 minutes. I straightened away from the panel. My knees filed their usual complaint, the one they'd been filing with increasing persistence since I crossed 60. I stripped off the work gloves and opened my hands, the copper jumper wire still coiled in my right fist. Nadine's dried blood still marking the left palm from the garage floor. "Let there be light," I said. The kind of thing a man says when he thinks no one worth mentioning is within earshot. Harriet was within earshot. She came off the doorframe she'd been leaning against and walked the length of the server room toward me. By the time she stopped, she was close enough that I could read something still present in her eyes. Not fear any longer, but the residue of it. The particular sharpness that settles into a person who has genuinely brushed up against dying and then had 20 minutes alone with that knowledge. "How does it feel?" she said, going from the man they were trying to escort out to the only one in the building who understood how to bring the lights back on. I turned the jumper wire over in my hand, 8 inches of copper and 2 alligator clips. The instrument that had just kept a $2 billion building alive. "About the same as it always does," I said. "Like a job that wanted doing." Harriet smiled. A small one, nothing performed about it. The first expression I'd seen from her that hadn't been assembled for an audience. For a moment it made her face into something warmer than the composed authority she carried everywhere else. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Durbin," she said. "But first I believe certain people upstairs are in your debt, and they ought to settle it in front of everyone. There is a particular brand of silence that descends after a verdict is read. Not an empty room's quiet, the quiet of a room packed with people who have just grasped which side of the outcome they're standing on and are urgently privately revising their calculations. That was the silence waiting for us when Harriet and I stepped off the elevator onto the 92nd floor. The building fully lit around us once more, the Chicago skyline burning cold and indifferent beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. 200 heads turned at the sound of the elevator doors parting. Then they turned toward Harriet. Then, with the particular discomfort of people freshly conscious of things they had rather not be linked to, a sizable portion of them turned away from Preston Ashford. Preston hadn't shifted from the spot where I'd last seen him. He stood near the windows in the restored light, and the darkness that had softened everything earlier was gone now. His jacket carried a slight rumple. The smooth command he'd projected all evening had tightened into something smaller and harder to hold. The look of a man watching the arithmetic he'd trusted quietly stop adding up. Gerard Whitmore moved first. "Harriet." He covered the floor toward us with the measured pace of someone who has landed on a decision and is crossing before second thoughts can catch him. "On behalf of Whitmore Capital, I want to state plainly that what took place tonight, both the incident in the parking garage and the failure of this building's systems, constitutes a fundamental breach of the representations made to our firm throughout the due diligence process. It constitutes more than that." Harriet didn't break stride. She walked to the center of the room, directly beneath the main lighting cluster, where no one present could avoid looking at her. "It constitutes deliberate fraud. My legal team began building their record the moment I had a working phone signal. The signal jammer has been photographed, cataloged, and is now in my attorney's custody." She fixed her eyes on Preston. "The fraud complaint is drafted and waiting for my authorization." Preston drew breath to speak. "Don't," Harriet said. One word, and it closed his mouth. Cornelia Ashford moved out from the crowd's edge, her diamonds catching the restored light, her face composed into an expression of stricken maternal horror. She'd had roughly 30 seconds to arrange. "Harriet, I want to be absolutely clear. I had no knowledge of any of this. Preston acted entirely on his own. The family had no—" "Cornelia!" Harriet turned to her with the patience of a woman who has been receiving this precise category of plea for half a century, and no longer has any use for it. "Your son is 40 years old. He is not a child whose missteps fall on the people who raised him. He is a man who committed fraud, created genuine danger, and took $75,000 from a 64-year-old widower." She let that land. "If you want to do something constructive tonight, you'll urge him to make this right before I pick up the phone." Cornelia's composure cracked along a line she'd been holding for years. Her jaw moved without producing words. Her hand went to the pearl necklace at her throat. She looked at Preston, and in that look, I saw something I hadn't anticipated. Not a mother's loyalty. The calculation of a woman deciding how far below the waterline she was willing to follow a vessel she'd helped steer onto the rocks. She stepped back. Preston read that clearly. I watched him read it. Watched it travel across his features the way a blackout travels a building level by level, light by light, going dark. The $75,000 was a family investment. His voice had shed its projection. Flat now mechanical, the voice of a man reciting a line he already knows has stopped working. Celeste confirmed. "Preston." Gerard Whitmore's voice was quiet and left no room. "Stop talking He turned toward Harriet. Voss Properties is your firm's anchor tenant across 3 of our current development projects. The $200 million commitment we discussed last quarter is the single largest position in Whitmore Capital's active portfolio. He straightened his jacket. Preston Ashford is no longer associated with Whitmore Capital, effective immediately. Preston made a sound. Not language, just sound. The sound of a man who spent 10 years building something and heard it come apart in one sentence. 72 hours, Preston. Harriet's voice held the temperature of Lake Michigan in February. Every dollar of Harold Durbin's money returned in full with interest, or I authorize the filing and you spend the next several years accounting for your business practices before a federal judge. The choice is not complicated. Preston glanced down at his wrist. The Patek Philippe Aquanaut, $15,000. He looked at it the way a person looks at an object once they've understood what it actually costs them. Understood. He said, the word leaving him like the final air bleeding out of a sealed room. I hadn't spoken since we came back upstairs. I'd taken a position near the elevator bank and watched it all move through its paces. And what I felt wasn't triumph, wasn't quite satisfaction either. Something quieter than both and more lasting. The sensation of a mechanism that has been out of true for a long time, finally finding its correct alignment. A load long carried off balance at last set right. Harriet came across the room toward me. The crowd tracked her doing it. 200 people, the deputy mayor, board members, investors, who move money in quantities I'd never see in a lifetime. Every one of them watched Harriet Crane walk past all of them and come to a stop in front of a 64-year-old pipe fitter from Bridgeport, the South Side, standing in a wrecked suit with rust on the collar and a copper jumper wire riding in his coat pocket. I meant what I said downstairs, she told me. I don't need a visionary. I need a master. She reached into her coat and produced a single folded sheet, a letter, dense with language, her attorney's letterhead, visible across the top. Chief Technical Advisor, Voss Properties. 47 buildings across North America. Full authority to audit the mechanical and electrical systems across every property in the portfolio, to impose manual first maintenance standards, and to build the training program I had demonstrated that evening from the foundation up. She held the page toward me. The salary is $380,000 annually, plus equity participation. I looked at the page, then at my hands, then at Preston Ashford, who stood very still near the windows, wearing the expression of a man just informed that the person he had spent the entire evening attempting to destroy had been handed the keys to the very kingdom he believed he was building. I took the page from Harriet's hand. I accept, I said, on one condition. Harriet's eyebrow lifted. The training program, I said. We call it the Nadine Durbin Standard, after my wife. Harriet held my gaze for a beat. Something crossed her expression that I couldn't fully name recognition, perhaps, or the quiet acknowledgement that passes between two people who have each lost something that cannot be replaced. Done, she said, and she shook my hand. The crowd thinned the way a storm does. First the thunder stops, then the rain, then the wind. And at the end, there is only the stillness of aftermath and the particular clarity that settles in once the air has been scoured clean of everything that was clouding it. The 92nd floor took roughly 2 hours to empty. Whitmore's team departed first, moving with the tight focus of people who had substantial restructuring to set in motion before sunrise. The board members followed in small clusters, voices low and purposeful. Cornelia left without a word in my direction. Spine rigid, her pearl necklace held in her fist, rather than resting at her throat, the only unguarded thing I had ever seen from her, and the truest. Preston was walked out by 2 of Whitmore's security staff at 9:45, the Audemars Piguet still on his wrist, because no one had yet identified the legal mechanism for taking it off him, though I had little doubt Harriet's attorneys were already working through that question. Harriet herself left with Whitmore at 10:00, pausing at the elevator to let me know her assistant would be in touch Monday morning with the formal offer documents. She shook my hand a second time, a firm, conclusive grip, and then she was gone. The 92nd floor of Apex Tower went quiet apart from the catering staff dismantling the tables and the low, constant sound of the Chicago wind pressing against the glass. I found the observation corridor off the main lounge, a narrower passage running the full length of the building's footprint, all glass, the lighting softer than the main room. Through the floor-to-ceiling panels, the city stretched out below in all its indifferent, brilliant complexity. 10,000 circuits burning in 10,000 directions, keeping 10 million lives in motion through the dark. I stood at the glass and looked at it and thought about Nadine. I heard Celeste's heels before I heard her voice. A different rhythm than earlier, slower now cautious. The sound of someone uncertain whether she has any right to the ground she's crossing. She stopped a few feet behind me. I didn't turn. "I don't know how to begin," she said. "And then don't begin," I said. "Just talk." A long silence. When she spoke again, the voice that came out of her was stripped to something I hadn't heard in 3 years. The voice she had before she learned to perform. A voice the one she'd had at 12 years old when she'd done something she couldn't carry alone and came to find me in the workshop. "I have been so afraid," she said. "Not of losing Preston, not of losing the apartment or the money or the position. I've been afraid of being ordinary, of being," her voice snagged, "of being from the South Side, of being the girl whose father fixed pipes for a living. I let Preston persuade me that where I came from was something to be managed, something to be kept quiet." She drew a breath that shook going in. "And I let him persuade me that you were part of what needed to be kept quiet." I turned around. Her face was undone mascara tracked down both cheeks. Eyes red and swollen, the professional composure that had held all evening completely gone. She looked young. She looked like the girl I had raised. She looked like Nadine around the eyes the way she always did when she was frightened and working hard not to show it. "I have your phone log," I said. I drew the folded paper from my jacket pocket and held it out. 37 calls Celeste. 3 months. I wrote them all down because I needed something to hold on to. Some proof that I had tried. She took the paper in both hands, unfolded it, looked at the entries, the dates, the times, the 2-word notes I had made about what I had called to say. Her shoulders began to shake. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth so hard I could see it whitening her skin. March the 15th. I said my voice-finding words I had turned over on 100 quiet evenings at my kitchen table. "I called because I had seen a photograph of Lily on your social media. I wanted to tell you she had your mother's eyes. You sent it to voicemail. You were at dinner." Celeste made a sound that had no word in it, something raw and broken rising from below, the place where language lives. "Mother's Day," I went on. "I called because it was the hardest day on the calendar. You texted at 11 at night to say the Ashford brunch had run long." I stopped. I looked at her. "I sat at your mother's grave that afternoon and told her you were just busy." I said it out loud, Celeste. The way you say a thing repeatedly hoping it will become true. Celeste's knees went out from under her. She went down onto the cold marble floor of the observation corridor, the way a structure falls when the load-bearing element finally gives, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. She was on her knees in her silver dress on the 92nd floor, both palms pressed flat against the cold stone, crying in a way she had not allowed herself since her mother died. Fully. Completely. Without any management of it at all. "I'm sorry." The words came out of her in fragments broken apart by the sobbing. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry. I let them make me ashamed of you. I let Preston take your money, and I told myself it was for us, for our future. And I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because I was so desperate for them to see me as one of them. And Celeste." I covered the distance between us and got my hands under her arms and brought her up to her feet. She rose and fell forward against my chest, her face against the rust-marked flannel, her hands twisting into the ruined fabric of the jacket I had pressed so carefully that morning. I held her the way I hadn't been able to hold her since Nadine's funeral. The way a father holds a child who has finally come home after being lost all the relief and grief and love compressed into the plain, physical fact of being present. After a long while, she pulled back just far enough to reach into the small clutch bag she'd carried all evening. Her hands were shaking badly. She worked the clasp twice before it gave. She took out a small velvet pouch, dark blue, worn soft from handling. My heart stopped. "I've had it since the week after the wedding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Preston said it was cheap. He said it would embarrass me in front of his mother's friends. I put it in my jewelry box and told myself I would return it when the time was right. And then time kept moving, and I kept not returning it, because returning it meant admitting what I had done. And She pressed the pouch into my palm, with both her hands wrapped around my fist, gripping hard. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I kept it. I'm so sorry I kept everything from you." I opened the pouch. Nadine's ring, silver band, small inset diamond. The ring I had purchased in the summer of 1987 with my first full month's wages from the pipe fitters' union, still warm from riding close to Celeste's body. solid and plain and entirely real in my palm. I couldn't speak for a moment. I pressed my fist shut around it and held that fist against my chest, just above where Nadine's note was still folded in my breast pocket. "I forgive you," I said when I could say it. But Celeste, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Trust is something we build from this point forward slowly with honesty. I held her gaze. "I need to know that the next time someone asks you to choose between your father and their approval, you choose me. Not because I'm requiring it, because you understand it's right." Celeste nodded, her whole body trembling with the effort of it. "I choose you," she said. "I should have always chosen you. I choose you." I drew her back in and held on. Outside the glass, the city kept moving, a million lights burning in a million windows. And somewhere down in Bridgeport, in a house that was finally paid for, Nadine's photograph sat in its silver frame on the kitchen counter, watching over a life that was at last slowly finding its way back to solid ground. A month after the night that changed everything, the 88th floor server room of Apex Tower smelled of fresh coffee and possibility rather than scorched silicon and dread. Harriet's renovation team had rebuilt it from the physical relay panels outward, properly rated contactors, correctly sized bus bars, manual override capability, engineered into every system from the ground up. I had signed off on every single circuit myself. It was the first time in 40 years that my name had been attached to something in a way that would outlast the job. The training space Harriet had created on the 82nd floor was simpler than I'd requested and better than I'd pictured. 18 workstations, proper ventilation, a tool wall along the west face with every hand tool labeled and within reach. And at the center of the room, on a low platform that Harriet had insisted on over my objections, sat a wooden workbench I recognized the moment I saw it, because I had built it myself in my Bridgeport basement in 1993 and had been using it in every job since. She had dispatched someone to collect it without a word to me. I walked into that training room on the first morning and stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds, just looking at that bench under the clean fluorescent light. "You can't teach from behind a touch screen," Harriet had said. When I called to ask her why she'd done it, she was right. My first cohort was 15 students, young engineers, from Whitmore Capital's new portfolio team, ranging from 24 to 31 years old. All of them technically proficient. All of them to varying degrees underprepared for the reality that the systems they monitored were physical objects existing in the world, not merely numbers populating a dashboard. "The dashboard is a translation," I told them the first morning. "It takes what the building is actually doing, the heat, the pressure, the load, the vibration, and renders it as colors and figures on a screen. That translation has value, but it is not the thing itself. Never mistake the map for the territory." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Petra Holden, 26 years old, the sharpest in the group, a fact I'd clocked within the first hour. She had her father's precision, she had told me, on day 2. He'd been an electrician in Philadelphia, killed in an arc flash accident when she was on 12. She had gone into engineering partly on his account, and partly to understand what had gone wrong, to understand what had taken him. "Mr. Durbin," she said, "the industry is moving toward full sensor integration and AI-assisted diagnostics. Isn't manual skills training a step backward?" I looked at her for a moment. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and drew out the copper jumper wire, the 8-inch piece I had used in the server room on March 15th. I had been carrying it since that night the way certain men carry a coin or a smooth stone, a physical anchor to a thing that had mattered. I set it on the workbench in front of her. On March 15th, I said a $2 billion smart building in the loop went completely dark. Every sensor in the facility was reading nominal. Every AI diagnostic was reporting stable. Every dashboard in the server room was green. I let a bead of silence fall. I fixed it with this 8 inches of copper and 2 clips that cost 40 cents at any hardware store in the country. I gave that room to breathe. Your father knew this. The AI didn't know it that night. The sensors didn't know it. The dashboards didn't know it. I picked the wire back up. "This isn't going backward, Petra. This is the foundation that everything else rests on." She looked at the wire for a long moment. Then she nodded, not the nod of someone conceding a point, but the nod of someone recognizing something they had already understood without a language for it. I spent the morning on the manual bypass technique. By afternoon, all 15 of them could locate a physical relay panel by sound and vibration alone, working in the dark. That was the first lesson. it would stay the most important one. At 11:47, my phone lit up with a notification. I'd been checking it with less of the low-grade desperation I had grown used to over the previous 18 months, that constant grinding tension of a man waiting on a message that never arrives. This notification was different. 2 transactions side by side in my banking app. The first was my opening paycheck from Voss Properties, a number I read 3 times the same way I'd been reading it in my head since Harriet had spoken it aloud on the 92nd floor. $380 annually. 40 years of union work, and I had never once seen a figure like that beside my name. Standing there in the fluorescent light of the training room, I had helped build what I felt wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, though it held both inside it. It was closer to the feeling of a load correctly balanced, a circuit properly grounded. The second transaction, $82,500, memo line debt repayment, Ashford C. principal, $75,000 plus interest per agreed terms. Preston had paid on time. 72 hours, not a minute, over which surprised me less than it might have a month earlier. A man with Harriet's attorneys monitoring his every financial movement tends to honor his deadlines. I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked out at my 15 students bent over their benches, their hands beginning to learn the language that their screens had never taught them. And I thought about Nadine, about what she would have made of this room, these young people, that workbench from our basement, standing in the center of it all, like the anchor it had always been. After the session, Petra came toward me with a rolled magazine tucked under one arm. She extended it with the careful deliberateness of someone offering something they consider significant. It was the April issue of Buildings and Infrastructure Quarterly, the most widely read trade publication in the field, the one I had noticed sitting in a stack in Celeste's apartment during our first lunch together, 2 weeks after the Apex Tower night. I hadn't mentioned seeing it then. The cover carried a photograph I hadn't known, was being taken me in my Bridgeport workshop, standing at the workbench with a length of copper pipe in my hands. The tool wall behind me, the light from the basement window angled across my face. The headline read, "The Durban Standard. Why the Future of Smart Cities Depends on Manual Mastery." My father would have read this article, Petra said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright in a way she wasn't working to conceal. He would have read it, and he would have called me, and he would have said, "See, I told you." She pressed her lips together. "I just wanted you to know that." My throat tightened. I said thank you, which felt entirely inadequate. She nodded and returned to her workstation. I stood there a moment, holding the magazine, thinking about all the fathers who had done the right work in the right way, in the right spirit, and never had a single word written about them. That evening, Celeste's text arrived at 6:15. "Dad, Lily, and I are coming over tomorrow morning. She wants to see your workshop. Is that okay?" I read it twice. Then I went down to the basement. The memory chest was under the canvas tarp where it had sat since the June night 3 years ago, when I had carried it home from the Palmer House parking lot. I pulled the tarp back and looked at it for a long time in the yellow light of that single basement bulb. Then I got my tools. I worked until midnight, reinforcing the dovetail joints, sanding the surfaces back to clean wood, repainting the carved initials on the lid. And in the secret compartment I had built into the miniature attic of the craftsman-style dollhouse, the one I had originally sent to Celeste's apartment and received back via automated reply, I placed the photograph of Nadine holding baby Celeste, taken in the backyard of the Bridgeport house in the summer of 1991. Nadine's face lit with the particular happiness of a woman who has everything she needs. I closed the compartment. I switched on the dollhouse lights, the grain of wheat bulbs I had wired into every room running off a small battery pack tucked under the porch. The whole structure glowed warm gold in the basement dark. The next morning, Celeste's Volvo pulled into the driveway at 9:15. The back door swung open before the car had fully stopped, and a small figure in a red coat came out of it, at a velocity that made clear she had been waiting to do exactly this for the entire drive from Chicago. Dark curls, Nadine's chin, Nadine's eyes. That was the first thing I saw, wide and brown and completely open, looking up at me from the driveway pavement. Lily, 4 years old with the guileless directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to put a mask on. "Grandpa Harold," she said, and her voice was something the blurry photographs on Celeste's social media had never been able to prepare me for, clear and bright and utterly certain of itself. "Mommy says you fix things." I was on my knees on the cold concrete before my mind had caught up to my body. She closed the last few feet at a run and landed against me with everything she had. Red coat on flannel, those dark curls finding my face, her arms cinched around my neck with a grip that said she had already made her assessment and I had passed it. I didn't speak. I held my granddaughter in that cold April driveway and let the moment be what it was. I fixed lots of things, little bird. I managed finally my mouth against her hair. Want to see? Down in the basement, the workshop carried its old smell cedar and linseed oil. Lily descended the stairs with both hands on the railing, moving slowly, and when she reached the bottom and caught sight of the craftsman-style dollhouse across the room, her eyes went so wide I could make out the warm glow of its lights reflected back from them. She didn't move. She just whispered, "Is that for me?" "It is," I told her, "but here's what you have to know. The magic is locked until you throw the switch yourself." I brought her up onto the workbench and helped her find the brass toggle tucked beneath the front porch, one small finger pressed down. A clean, satisfying click, the sound only things built correctly will give you, and every window in the house flooded with warm gold light. What came out of Lily then was somewhere past a laugh and short of a scream. The unfiltered, unself-conscious delight of a child who has just received something better than she knew to hope for. She put her palms against the sides of the house and worked her way around it, methodically examining every lit room through the windows. "There's a kitchen," she announced in the tone of someone filing an official report. "And a bedroom." Then she went still. "There's a tiny door up in the ceiling." "That's the attic," I said. "There's something in there I left for you." She worked it open with 2 fingers, careful as a surgeon, and lifted out the photograph. Nadine backyard of the Bridgeport house, summer of 1991, with baby Celeste cradled against her shoulder. Her face angled toward the camera, wearing a happiness so uncomplicated, I had spent 30 years failing to find the right words for it. "Who is she?" Lily asked. "Your grandmother Nadine," I said. "She was gone before you came into the world, but she would have loved you in a way that would have overwhelmed you both." Lily held the photograph and looked at it seriously. Then she looked past me at Celeste, who stood in the workshop doorway with one palm pressed against the center of her chest, and tears moving down her face without any attempt to stop them. "Mommy," Lily said with the frank authority of a 4-year-old stating facts, "you look happy in this picture." Celeste laughed and cried, and the same breath came across the workshop floor and gathered all of us into her arms at once. Me, Lily, the glowing house, Nadine's face smiling out from the photograph, and she did not let go. 7 months after that, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I was working pie crust at the kitchen counter in the Bridgeport house when the bell rang. I hadn't been expecting company until Thursday. I looked through the peephole. Cornelia Ashford stood on the step in a camel coat, a store-bought pecan pie held out in front of her, with the stiff uncertainty of a woman not in the habit of carrying things she hadn't ordered someone else to select. Reginald Ashford, 67, stood a half step behind her, quieter, more careful, with the posture of a man who had made a long practice of stepping aside and was beginning to reckon with what that habit had cost everyone around him. I opened the door. "Harold!" Reginald's voice was plain and unhesitating. "Thank you for having us. We don't deserve it, and I want you to know that I know that." "Nobody deserves Thanksgiving," I said. "That's the whole point of it. Come in." Cornelia crossed my threshold for the first time in her life. She took in the room, the furniture worn honest by decades of use, the plain walls, Nadine's photograph in its silver frame on the mantel, and something behind her expression gave way. Not a collapse, something quieter. The particular undoing that happens when a person finds themselves standing inside something more real than their usual surroundings. "Harold," she stopped, drew herself together, and tried again. Her voice had the tight, careful quality of someone who has been carrying a weight for 7 months and has finally decided to put it on the table. "I told my son that people who use their hands for a living were beneath our consideration. I led Celeste to believe her roots were something to keep hidden. I helped unravel my own family through sheer arrogance." Her jaw set and released. "I am deeply and genuinely sorry." The kitchen held its quiet, just the oven working, and from the living room, the distant sound of Lily narrating something to herself. "What's done is done, Cornelia," I said. "But a seat at this table comes with terms. In this house we say what's true. We treat every person as worth the same respect. And we don't forget that a man who works with his hands carries as much value as anyone walking." She nodded. Not the smooth social nod, something smaller than that, something she had to reach for. Reginald came forward and shook my hand properly. I held my tongue when I should have spoken up, he said. It won't happen that way again. I believed that. Lily said, Grace on her feet, standing on her chair so she could see the whole table, which I had already privately ruled was exactly right. Thank you, God, for Grandpa Harold who fixes things, she said, eyes shut tight, hands folded with the grave sincerity of a child for whom this is serious business. Thank you for Mommy, who is learning to be brave. Thank you for the dollhouse with the lights. And thank you that families can get broken and then get fixed the same as Grandpa's pipes. Amen. When the meal was finished and Lily lay asleep on the couch with Nadine's photograph tucked inside her fist, Cornelia placed an envelope on the table. This isn't charity, she said. It's Reginald's and my attempt to return something real to a world we've spent a long time drawing from. Her hands folded over each other. We want to establish a trade school scholarship. One recipient every year, full tuition, and all materials for any student in the city coming up through the mechanical or electrical trades. We'd like it to carry the name Nadine Durbin Memorial Scholarship. $150,000 to found it with contributions each year after. I looked at Nadine on the mantel. I looked at Reginald watching me with the face of a man who has taken a step and isn't certain it was far enough. She would have loved that, I told him. She held trade education the way others hold religion, all the way, no reservations. Reginald smiled, a real one unperformed, the only such expression I had ever seen from him. Celeste has been telling us about her, he said quietly. These past 7 months, we should have thought to ask years ago. After the Ashfords had gone and Celeste was at the sink with the dishes, I stopped in the living room doorway and took in the house, the lived-in furniture, the plain walls, the life assembled here through 4 decades of early mornings and labor that had mattered whether or not anyone had noticed. I drew Nadine's ring from my pocket and placed it on the mantel in front of her photograph. Not for any symbolic reason, because that was where it belonged beside her, the way every good thing in my life had always found its place beside her. We made it Nadine, I said, all of us. Celeste came up behind me, dish towel over one hand. I got offered something today, she said. Harriet's community outreach director, putting Voss projects in conversation with neighborhoods like this one. The South Side Bridgeport, all of it. A pause. Real work, Dad. Work I can stand behind. Work that would have made Mom proud. Work I'm proud of, I said. That's the part I'm still working on, she said. I turned and looked at my daughter. Not a glance, a real look, the first one in 3 years, that didn't have the whole accumulated weight of everything between us sitting on top of it. She was standing in her mother's kitchen, and Nadine's eyes were looking back at me out of her face. You'll get there, I said. She came across to me and held on, and I held her back. Outside the window, the South Side moved through its ordinary evening, the EL train rolling somewhere above the city, doing what cities do. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, thank you. That means something to me. This story cost Harold a great deal before it gave anything back. 3 years of silence. A daughter who had drifted so far, she'd forgotten the sound of her own roots. A life's worth of honest work that the wrong people had decided to treat as something embarrassing. But I believe God doesn't waste the waiting, and Harold's long season of being overlooked turned out to be exactly the preparation the right moment required. What looked like being left behind was really just the slow accumulation of something that couldn't be faked or bought. Here is what I take from Harold's story, and I hope you carry at least one of these with you. Never let someone else's shame about your work become your own. The hands that keep the lights on are never the hands to be ashamed of. If someone asks you to make yourself smaller so they can appear larger, that is not love. Walk away from that arrangement before it costs you more than you can afford to lose. When the chance to forgive arrives, take it not for the other person, but because carrying the weight of what they did is a tax on your own life. And hold on to the people who knew you before the world had an opinion about you. They are the ones who will still be standing there when the noise clears. For every adult's 50-plus listener who found this story, whether this is your first family revenge story here, or you've been with Honor Revenge Stories for a while, I hope Harold's journey reminded you that character built quietly in the dark is still character. It doesn't expire. Leave me a comment with what landed hardest for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about dignity holding its ground, please pass this one along. Subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.